For translation? For you? Or do you know what? German?
Right. Well, I guess I might be.
Übersetzungsgeräte am hinteren Ende des Raumes, Englisch, Deutsch. Translation devices in the back. Anybody who needs one? Okay. Wow, full house. Gut, dann legen wir los. Ich habe schon gesagt, super cool, das zu sehen, nach dem starken Plenum gestern auf heute ins Haus. Ich werde zunächst auf Deutsch ein paar allgemeine Informationen sagen. Das Wichtigste zuerst, wir haben die Notausgänge hier. Das ist ein Ausgang, der andere ist gleich rechts. Also, das habt ihr jetzt abgespeichert. Dann sage ich ein paar Worte zum anderen Davos. Seit 1999 ist das andere Davos die jährliche Gegenveranstaltung zum WEF, wo alternative revolutionäre Perspektiven aufgeklärt werden. Das andere Davos wird durch BFS durchgeführt. Wir sind eine antikapitalistische Organisation, die in feministischen, internationalistischen, ökologischen Arbeitskämpfen engagiert. Wir sind jetzt am Morgen des zweiten Tages. Am Nachmittag geht es gleich weiter, also ihr könnt euch schon mal ein Event aussuchen, wo ihr nach dem Mittag hingehen werdet. Das sind alles super Events. Das andere Davos zu organisieren, ist immer auch ein großer Kostenaufwand. Da gehen die Flüge mit rein, die Raummieten. Also wenn ihr etwas mit uns teilen könnt, dann sind wir natürlich sehr dankbar über jeden Betrag. Ja, und dann wäre es das schon von meiner Seite und wir steigen inhaltlich ein.
And we're going to switch to English now. We're living a truly dark and disappointing timeline. A few days ago, I had one of those moments where it dawns on you just how scary all this is, how infuriatingly fucked up things are internationally. It can feel incapacitating. I realize that there isn't much new information we can share in this short introduction about the current state of US imperialism and fascization. The media zone is flooded here as well. Every time we open our phones or a newspaper, we see the same patterns. The global drift towards authoritarianism, the cyclical rot of capitalism, the normalization of violence, rampant inequality. Umberto Eco's 14 features of fascism read today like a checklist for the regime in the United States, and increasingly so for European countries. The monsters we're up against feel different. They're bigger, uglier, often faceless, masked, and have moved into our streets, our communities, our institutions, and our media. They wear suits, carry badges, write policy, and repress through the language of security, order, and legality. They administer borders, prisons, and austerity. Trump is coming to the World Economic Forum and will be staying in a church in Davos, with the setup being sponsored by Microsoft and McKinsey, among others, contributing $1 million respectively. I have close family and friends in many of the places we'll be hearing about today, and I know many of you here do too. So before we dive into our first speaker's input, I would like to acknowledge what it means to be here in this room together, in solidarity with the people of Palestine, Sudan, Congo, Venezuela, the US, Syria, Rojava, Colombia, the SADR, Iran, Ukraine, and with all those living under the consequences of capitalistic empire. We're here to hear from two people who know these cowardly monsters, their faces and tactics, and who are actively disrupting the normalization of their actions. out of necessity. We will hear inputs and examples on how structures of resistance can grow and be strengthened in the face of growing authoritarianism, in solidarity and in humanity that knows no boundaries. Please join me in welcoming two comrades from the Tempest Collective in the USA, of which only one is here right now. The other will be joining us later, with whom the BFS has links through the Fourth International. First, we'll hear from Avery Smith, here, who is a social worker based in San Diego, head of the education committees for the Union SEIU Local 221, and is active in cross-border work and solidarity with immigrants and Palestine. After the break, Shireen Akram-Bashar will be joining us. She is a socialist writer and an activist with extensive Middle East solidarity work, particularly on Palestine, Syria, and Sudan. Shireen is a contributor at Truth Out magazine and an editor at Spectre Journal, and recently moved to New York City. So I'm going to hand over to Avery now.
Donald Trump aims to institute ethno-nationalist autocracy as the new international hegemonic form of governance. Not just in the United States, internationally, he aims to do that. If successful, this will amount to a sweeping defeat of capitalist democracy. Elections may or may not remain, but they won't be free or fair. Freedom of speech, organization, and religion may or may not continue to formally exist, but fear and repression will increasingly marginalize them. The rule of law will become increasingly corrupt. Democracy and freedom under capitalism have always been partial, contested, and hypocritical at best. Democracy is fundamentally incompatible with class rule because masses, if they have democratic power, resist exploitation. But in struggle, our class has won elements of democracy and freedom inside capitalism. These are precious resources that allow real space for our free development as humans, for our socialization into incipient habits of self-rule, and most importantly, for our ability to wage collective class struggles to defend our lives and living standards. How has this sudden nightmarish retreat of capitalist democracy come about? We're living in a vicious cycle, a downward spiral that began in the early 1970s. The economic crisis of those years led to a new cycle of class struggle. And unlike the previous cycle of class struggle, in which our class won mass unionization, welfare states, and decolonization, this neoliberal cycle saw the capitalist class win back uncontested social hegemony. And with the global defeat of labor movements, the left, and economic sovereignty for the post-colonial world in that period, the global working class suffered increasing impoverishment, insecurity, and atomization. So with few mass experiences of collective power, mass class consciousness in turn declined. And declining class consciousness and organization both fed into each other, a downward spiral. The 2008 Great Recession accelerated social decline, but long brewing working class frustration burst forth into a backlash against inequality. And this was the fuel for a new ideological cycle, nurturing a new and necessarily very immature class consciousness. The Arab Spring revolutions and the social movements from Greece to Spain to the US, like the Occupy movement of 2011 and the Black Lives Matter movement of 2014, these things seeded the emergence of a new political left. In the US, most notably in the form of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaigns. Simultaneously, starting in 2008, the middle class of small business people, also devastated by the recession, radicalized in the opposite direction, to the right. The much smaller social base of this conservative, libertarian, and authoritarian reaction meant that it was, at first, overshadowed by the new left. But in the US, Sanders and the suddenly massive organization Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, have tried unsuccessfully to make the incurably capitalist Democratic Party into a workers' party. And the problems of that mean that the post-2008 new class consciousness lacked the maturity to move forward. This new class consciousness is still with us, and it is maturing toward independent class struggle politics and organization, the kind that it would take to push back neoliberalism and authoritarianism that we now have. But it hasn't gotten to that level of maturity yet. That's the process we have to encourage. The new right, by contrast, was born adjacent to massively resourced media and other infrastructures created over decades by ruling class cranks who had never accepted the democratic advances of the welfare state era. And the ruling class as a whole, not just the cranks, while they were disturbed by the authoritarian, nationalist, and protectionist leanings of this new right, they still naturally accepted them more readily than they could ever accept the new left. So, in 2016, the ruling class, including the Democratic Party itself, united to defeat Sanders' insurgency inside that party. The Republican Party, on the other hand, proved unable by this time to resist Trump's takeover. Still, the capitalists were sharply divided on Trump during his first term, but the 2025 inauguration was quickly followed by a wave of corporate preemptive compliance, is the term that they're using, and we're seeing it in Davos with Microsoft's funding, corrupt funding of Trump's presence. So looking back, the strains of the 2008 Great Recession and also the 2020 COVID recession weakened the ideological hegemony of the US ruling class as exercised through the two-party system. They locked out the only genuinely popular alternative, that of Sanders. But with the two parties stalemated against each other, they were unable to prevent the rise of autocratic Trumpisms. And Trump, having defeated that traditional ruling class means of containing politics within acceptable boundaries, thus operates with a new and horrifyingly dangerous, though far from absolute, degree of political autonomy. Trump has political autonomy. He's converted the Republican Party, conservative media, conservative religious denominations, conservative state governments, and millions of US voters into something like his personal cult followers. His policies of layoffs, budget cuts, tax cuts for the rich, mass deportation, attacks on trans people, climate change denialism, warmongering bellicosity, and support of international authoritarianism are not popular. They're massively unpopular. Within 9 months, 9 furious months of his rule, he lost political initiative, with his support having dropped from 50% to 38%, and probably dropping more. Yet his basic forces retain cohesion, resources, and control of the US state. Trump will not stop until he is stopped. And he will continue to probe and push until he finds the political moment to decisively advance and eventually consolidate autocracy. It's not clear whether recklessly brutal attacks on Venezuela, Iran, or elsewhere can provide Trump with a moment like that, but he certainly hopes they can. So socialists in the US find ourselves in the fight of our lives. Yet it is anything but a hopeless fight. Trumpism is engendering massive resistance. Trump's high-profile invasions using the Border Patrol, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and National Guard forces of several US cities, including Washington, D.C., Portland, Chicago, and Los Angeles, have caused an unprecedented, neighborhood-based, working-class solidarity movement with immigrant workers. In Los Angeles and elsewhere, ICE raids have been met with mass protests. Arrests of immigrants were thwarted in the streets in many cases. They could not take people away because of the crowds that protected them. Tow truck drivers in Los Angeles began towing Border Patrol vans when they parked. They would just tow them away. Protesters started gathering outside the hotels where these out-of-town ICE agents were coming to stay, and just making noise all through the night until the hotel owners asked the ICE agents to leave because they didn't want their other guests to be up all night. This immigrant and working class resistance in LA last June rallied nationwide sympathy and fed directly into those No-Kings-Protests, if you heard about those. And that's really what made the No-Kings-Protests the largest in US history. This month, the ICE killing of Renee Nicole Good, horrendously slandered as a terrorist by Homeland Security Chief Kristi Noem. Her killing sparked spontaneous demonstrations, not just in the big cities, massive demonstrations all across the country, large towns, small towns. And protests like these and No Kings achieve vital short-term political objectives. While they're happening, they force corporate media to reframe national political narratives with an authentic voice from below that's usually locked out. And when this reframing of the national political discussion happens, support for the status quo erodes rapidly. When our voice begins to shape the discussion, it begins to win it over. And these temporary effects of these mass protests provide those doing the demonstrating with a sense of our popular power. Now, while these types of protest movements are notoriously ineffectual on their own, they do feed the growing determination needed to create more consolidated political alternatives, which is what we need. Stephen Miller, white ethno-nationalist ideologue and member of Trump's cabinet, has given ICE a quota of 3,000 arrests a day across the country. But dogged by protest and facing an immigrant population now trained by neighborhood defense organizations in knowing their rights if ICE should come to their doors, have only been able to arrest 1,200 a day. The quota is 3,000, but they can't manage it. The solidarity movement has won over public opinion. Don't let anyone tell you that the United States population supports the scapegoating and deportation of the immigrant population. 70% of the population opposes Trump's immigration policies. 70%. This movement in solidarity has been the main force capable of directly inflicting political defeats on the president. At the same time, unfortunately, it has been reported that some 2 million immigrants have voluntarily left the country this year. Those that remain, including many who have legal status in the country, often are just staying in their homes all the time. They rely on family or solidarity activists to go shopping and bring food to their house. Some of them are keeping their kids home from school. The repression it's doing two things then. It's, on the one hand, promoting a truly massive wave of working class community self-organization. But it's simultaneously putting a blanket of fear over immigrant-led class struggle in other forms. But in terms of the positive part of that, in San Diego County, where I live, whereas a year ago there were none, now there are 5 community defense organizations. And I think there's at least 2 others organizing last time I checked. Trump's threats to send the National Guard to cities, supposedly to fight crime, but really to humiliate and punish cities with Democratic Party mayors, has generated broad pushback. When Trump threatened to do this in Chicago, Mayor Brandon Johnson, a black man and former lobbyist for the Chicago Teachers Union, more of which about later, said there should be a general strike in response. In San Francisco, a similar talk from actual unions talk about the need to strike or a general strike met Trump's threats to send the troops into San Francisco. And in San Francisco, tech industry bosses, citing the need to avoid the kind of upheaval that this would create because of their massive investments in artificial intelligence, which they just are bringing online, and they need social stability in order to bring those online, they lobbied Trump to call off the invasion because of that. In both cases, in Chicago and San Francisco, through a combination of working class opposition and ruling class fears, Trump backed down. So let's think a little bit about what the bigger picture is in terms of how to build on this resistance and whether it can win. The U.S. labor movement is in a contradictory state, combining decline with ferment and revitalization. Communist, socialist, and Trotskyist workers rooted in the rank and file of unions and organizing drives provided the militant, democratic, social justice vision and tactics that enabled the giant step of the U.S. labor movement in the 30s and 40s. Socialists won a mass base in the new industrial unions of that time, but then ruling class politicians from liberal Democrat Harry Truman to Republican fanatic Joseph McCarthy used law and repression to jail, expel, and marginalize them as socialist workers by the mid-1950s. The many-sided struggles of the 1960s, led by the Black Freedom and anti-Vietnam War movements, promoted resistance from below in all sectors and spilled over into strike waves throughout the 70s. But the new left of that time failed to reintegrate with this new labor movement. And that was partly due to their Stalinist, Maoist, sectarian party-building stances. But I would argue that the 60s left's turn to Leninism globally was premature. creating organizations too far removed from the state of mass working class consciousness of the time to become mass forces. In some cases, as with the independent socialists in California, or the international socialists in England, their reorganization as these Leninist democratic centralist organizations quickly sacrificed most of their previous mass and especially workplace roots. But there was an exception, in the US at least. Among dozens of competing New Left sects, the 500 or less members of the International Socialists organized with the wave of wildcat strikes and union opposition caucuses in the 70s to create lasting left-wing infrastructure in the US labor movement. And this was centered around the publication known as Labor Notes, and also in the truck drivers' union opposition movement called Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And these forces worked together and fostered similar left-wing activity from the 70s into the new century, to this century, in many union locals across the United States, usually with the involvement of worker socialists. In the era of Sanders and Democratic Socialists of America, Labor Notes and Teamsters for a Democratic Union have actually lost vital political independence and militancy, but not before they were able to nurture the rise of the Caucus of Radical Educators, or CORE, who led a rank-and-file takeover in the Chicago Teachers Union in 2010. CORE built support by mobilizing teachers from the classrooms to support the struggles of black families in neighborhoods against plans to close down schools in their neighborhoods. The union had been doing that, but CORE got the union to do that. And these community-based anti-racist struggles then fed back into militancy around workplace issues, culminating in the 2012 Chicago teachers strike against Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff for President Obama. And this strike included mass marches that shut down traffic in the downtown area, support in the polls from 2/3 of the city's population, including massive support in Black Chicago. And they ended with dramatic concessions from the previously powerful mayor. And such clear victories and massive public support were very rare for unions during their decades of defeat and decline. That decline was real. Unions went from 25% of workers in 1979 to 10% today. Private sector unionization, once the bastion of union strength, is down to 6%, with close to 30% of public sector workers like me unionized. While the percentage of workers in unions has declined more with Trump's unilateral derecognition of federal employee unions, the Chicago teacher strike nevertheless did reverse the long-term decline in worker activism. Strikes, well, they haven't gone back to the 1970s strike wave levels, have increased. In 2018, teachers carried out unprecedented statewide strikes in the Republican-led states of West Virginia, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Arizona. Radical caucuses like CORE have gained ground in a bunch of unions, especially teachers' unions like the Los Angeles Teachers Union, which had their own very successful, massive community-supported strike in 2019. Labor's revitalization is clearest among teachers, but it's also affected nurses, auto workers, truck drivers, Starbucks baristas, Amazon employees, and many others. Support for unions is at a historically high level. 77% of the people support unions. And most importantly, awareness of unions unions and belief in the effectiveness of strikes has risen, reappeared, redawned on our consciousness in the United States. With Trump's re-election, that same Chicago Teachers Union created an innovative nationwide coalition called May Day Strong. And this was formed to begin exploring ways to use union strike power to prevent authoritarian state transformation. By creating an open space with conference calls involving thousands of activists, mostly union members from all around the country, this group is attempting to take concrete steps toward the ability of the working class to mount a general strike. And that idea, general strike, in US political and even union culture had been forgotten for generations. It's coming back and actively being fostered. All of this creates favorable context for us, for socialists. Our union movement, like most around the world, is stymied by top union officers. This social layer separates itself from its mass membership for higher pay and social access to the ruling class that they negotiate with. They tend to discourage strikes, organizing drives, or anything that risks the stable union finances on which we survive. We're going to have to take risks to defeat Trumpism. But these same union leaders have also fretted for decades now about their declining membership numbers and dues base. And the main thing they've tried to do about it, write million-dollar checks for Democratic Party candidates, has failed spectacularly, with militant anti-union fanatics now in charge of the federal government and much of the country. They're aware that what they've tried to do hasn't worked. Socialists influenced by the rank-and-file strategy, historically promoted by that group Labor Notes, have been building independent rank-and-file activities scattered across the country for decades. But today, we find ourselves in a labor movement with ideological ferment at the top, relatively less closed at the top to our initiatives from below. Meanwhile, the rank and file, the masses of workers and union members, are angered by unaffordable housing costs. They're aware of union successes. They're upset by authoritarianism, and not infrequently themselves personally targeted by federal attacks on immigrants, on trans people, on Muslims, and others. Some of us in the Tempest organization, drawing on this example of synergy between anti-racist community organizing and union militancy, from the Chicago Teachers example, are fighting to bring our unions into community ICE defense efforts. For example, in my union, representing 13,000 public sector employees in the San Diego area, we formed a rank-and-file committee to organize trainings for workers at county buildings. There's these county social service buildings all over the county. Dozens or hundreds of workers at each one, 1,000 community members coming into these buildings. We are organizing trainings for the workers about what to do to protect our community if ICE comes to our buildings. We want to make all these buildings fortresses of ICE defense. And we want them to become sites that promote community self-organization through the ICE defense organizations. So by merging with and providing organized worker power to this new mass social movement of the immigrant working class, we aim to position the labor movement as the leader in every social movement against oppression and for democracy. We aim to demonstrate to the new activists of the broad left the centrality of the workers' movement and the power of rank-and-file organizing within unions. And we aim to identify and link together in action the radicals within our unions laying the basis for the fight to transform those unions, just like the Chicago teachers transformed theirs. This type of organizing is also intertwined with cross-union rank-and-file organizing, getting people from different unions in the same area to find common projects. And in San Diego, and also I know in Vermont, pro-Palestine workers from different unions came together in 2024 during the campaign against Gaza to press labor leadership in their areas to oppose the Gaza genocide. And these networks, created to do that, have gone on to become nascent local labor left formations. In San Diego, ours is called the Labor Solidarity Action Network. There are also a few Tempest members building new worker education initiatives. My union local has a monthly labor history class, as well as a Unions 101 class aimed at new members. These are rank and file projects within our union. And both of them bring a class-conscious worldview to workers not otherwise exposed to left-wing ideas like that. And I'm aware of similar Tempest member organizing in United Educators of San Francisco and in the Chicago Teachers Union. There's been at least some discussion of the need for class consciousness education more broadly. For example, by the president of the Painters Union, International Union of Painters across the country. He's not a socialist, but he agrees with this idea, Jimmy Williams. In the first half of the 20th century, when we were strongest as the workers' movement, socialist and anarchist movements built workers' schools. Revolutionaries like Luxemburg and Lenin championed these workers' schools, and these people saw mass struggle itself as the highest, broadest school of class consciousness. Nothing can teach you like mass struggle. That's the best school. But that understanding did not prevent them from recognizing that full class consciousness can only be achieved through collective study, without which the admittedly more important struggle component remains incomplete. And the new left of the 1968 generation, even that small minority who did make progress in reintegrating with the broad workers' movement, failed to advance on this crucial educational side. But the mass popularity of general social democratic tinged socialism today creates ripe conditions to add worker education initiatives into the overall rank and file strategy for building the workers and socialist movements. To conclude, Donald Trump may well succeed in converting the US and even much of the world into ethno-nationalist post-democracies. The scale of resistance so far also suggests that he also may not succeed. Defeating incipient autocracy requires militant, class-conscious direct action with an uncompromising commitment to solidarity with all the oppressed. The mass sentiments for this exist. Millions of people are hungry for exactly this, and millions are beginning to do it. But the Democratic Party fights for a different, for a doomed approach to confronting Trumpism, based on conciliation with the capitalist class and with center-right electoral opportunism, such as the presidential campaigns of Biden and Harris. Even if this approach were to succeed in the short term at the ballot box, it would actually assist the long-term success of the MAGA movement. So socialists in the US must fight within the resistance for the kind of resistance that can win and win sustainably. In the process, we must attend to all aspects of building mass working class consciousness. We had it a century ago. We have to build it back. Only the mass rebirth of this class consciousness which can explain our social crisis based on the ruling class's exploitation of those of us who create the actual wealth. Only that understanding can undermine, compete against, and eventually replace the new ethno-nationalism, which blames capitalist social crisis on ethnic and racial others, and which unfortunately does not even need majority support to impose its dominance. Trump never had majority support. Hitler never had majority support. It doesn't mean they can't win. We have to face, there is a possibility, in the frightening possibility that autocracy consolidates in the next 3 years. It will likely lead to decades of social instability, if not collapse. But in that context, building on today's efforts to organize class struggle and consciousness, including socialist organization, can realistically place our movement to play an important part in the future revolution that would likely result. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating. Before we take a break, please take a minute to write down or to remember any questions you might like to ask Avery afterwards. We'll have a whole round of questions at the very end after our second speaker. Yeah, and then we'll take a break for 20 minutes. See you then. Right, thank you. To make it into more of a workshop where there's a little bit of interaction, we hung up a wall in the back, a piece of paper, where you can share, on the one hand, thoughts, hot takes, anything you would like to share, and ideas on how people can organize and what we can actually do in our everyday lives to contribute to the struggle. Write whatever you feel.
Okay, I'm going to refreshing break. For the second part of this morning's session, I'm very happy to introduce Shireen Akhtam-Bouchard. Shireen is an academic, a revolutionary socialist activist, and a writer, political contributor to the Truth Out magazine, and editor at the Spectre Journal. She hails from the East Coast, and she's an active member of solidarity networks concerning Palestine, Syria, and Sudan. Shireen, you have the floor.
All right, I'll try to speak slowly. Let me know if I'm going too fast. So Trump began the new year with a renewed dedication to imperialism on the one hand and to anti-immigrant crackdowns in the US on the other. On January 3rd, Trump bombed Venezuela and kidnapped Maduro and his wife after months of escalating threats and murderous attacks on boats coming from Venezuela, and declared that the US would run the country for the coming years. Trump then threatened neighboring Latin American countries like Cuba that they would be next. He has also continuously threatened to bomb Iran, which is in the midst of a popular uprising against its regime and certainly needs no US meddling. And he even threatened to take control of Greenland. This ramped up, reckless imperialism has been paired with harsh crackdowns against immigrants in the US. On January 6th, Trump launched a massive ICE operation in Minneapolis, Minnesota, sending some 2,000 ICE agents to the city after demonizing Somali residents there with blatant white nationalist racist rhetoric. Since the start of his second presidency, Trump has drastically ramped up ICE attacks, sending ICE agents to cities across the country and greenlighting their violent attacks on migrants, people of color in general, and protesters. On January 7th, an ICE agent shot and killed Renee Good in Minneapolis as she was acting as a legal observer of ICE's raids. This wasn't the first time ICE killed someone over the past year. In fact, in 2025, some 30 people died in ICE custody. But it sparked protests across the US in the days that followed. So protests emerged spontaneously and then with quick planning, and combined the forces of the far left with liberal forces that had organized the No-Kings-Proteste in the early summer of 2025. Some 20,000 protesters came out in New York City last weekend. This time, the slogan of the protesters was "No war, no kings, no ICE," which shows radicalization and slogans and demands from the previous No Kings rallies. And also the connections people are making between Trump's wars and imperialist attacks abroad and his authoritarianism and anti-immigrant attacks at home. In Minnesota, for no work, no school, and no shopping, essentially. Already, high school students in Minneapolis have walked out for at least 3 days in a row. This was over the past week. We will have to see if the Minnesota union's organizing can make the January 23rd shutdown successful, and then if it can become a blueprint for actions in other cities and states across the US. The Trump administration has so far responded by demonizing Renee Good and blaming her for her murder, by sending even more ICE agents to Minnesota, and by ending protected status for Somalis in the US after ending it for over 1 million other migrants over the course of the past year. While the organizing against Trump has been largely through diffuse actions over the course of his second presidency, meaning many protests in different places, but not as many nationally organized protests, the killing of Renee Good seems to be a turning point, with at least the potential for more organization and coordinated actions in various cities and states. Over the past year, the fight against ICE has become the sharpest edge of the struggle in the US. The struggle against ICE has encouraged more grassroots organizing and shown that activists and community members must rely on each other and not on Democratic Party politicians to protect their communities and fight back against Trump and his deportation machine. It has become the center point of organizing, taking over from the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which was the center of struggle until last year. And there's no coincidence that protesters mobilizing against ICE across the country raise Palestinian flags and wear keffiyehs, as the struggle for Palestine has been central to radicalization and popular consciousness over the past 2.5 years, and influenced the movement against ICE and against Trump. In fact, at the start of Trump's second presidency, Trump's attacks initially focused on Palestine solidarity activists and left-wing international graduate students in higher education. Graduate students like Mahmoud Khalil, Liqa Kordia, and Rumeisa Unter, among many others, were detained in March of last year and threatened with deportation for their activism as a way to try to crush the Palestine Solidarity Movement. The students were accosted in the street or when arriving home by plainclothes ICE agents and taken to immigration centers thousands of miles away for months, if not longer. For example, Liqa Kordia is still in immigration detention, and a couple days ago, Mahmoud Khalil was told that his case is being reopened for the potential of him being deported again. So it's a back and forth in the court system, which we cannot rely on to defend us. After their arrest by ICE, thousands of international graduate students and assistant professors, and not just those associated with the Palestine Solidarity Movement, had their visas revoked and were unable to return to the US. And there's no doubt why this was one of Trump's first acts of repression. The Palestine Solidarity Movement had peaked in the US during the student encampment movement the year before, and it was the center of left-wing and anti-imperialist struggle that pinpointed US complicity with Israel and kept the genocide in Gaza from being sidelined from media attention and concern. Biden and Harris had ridiculed the Palestine Solidarity Movement and facilitated the repression of the movement while Biden was the president, as university administrations in Democrat-controlled states expelled activist students and rescinded degrees. They also sent police onto Palestine Solidarity encampments and physically attacked them in ways that hadn't been seen since the 1960s and 70s. You want me to slow down?
Yes. We have no translation, you have to speak slowly. We have no translation.
Yes,
It's
sorry.
technical
The
problem.
battery ran out. We just need a few seconds to get the battery working again.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Translation. Okay. Should I just pause until we have it? Okay.
You should do it yourself, then you see what we mean.
I can translate, but only to Arabic. Which I don't think our language is here.
Okay.
Okay. So yes, the attacks on the Palestine encampments were reminiscent of, it reminded people of attacks against the student movements against the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s, but were described as even more brutal and violent. So yes, Democrats were part of that process of shutting down and policing campuses. But during Trump's re-election campaign, he promised to ramp up this repression by deporting pro-Palestine activist students, and then he did his best to make that happen, while also threatening the funding of universities that allowed protests to continue. Worse still, many of these university administrations complied, even preemptively bending over backwards to Trump's wishes and making their universities hostile to any activism or free speech. The Palestine Solidarity Movement, as I said, had taken its strongest form in the US in the form of the encampments on university campuses in cities across the country, demanding attention returned to the genocide in Gaza, as well as in the movement's rejection of Biden and understanding of Biden as complicit, and rejecting the lesser evilism forced onto us by liberals every 4 years, which demand, every 4 years you have to vote for Democrat, otherwise Voldemort will take power, basically. Or the end of the world will come, even though, as Avery talked about, even when Democrats win in the short term, there's a long march further to the right in the long term. The Palestine Solidarity Movement also brought back an understanding of the need for regular mass protest, which had lulled a bit since the start of Biden's campaign and the defeat of the latest wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. Nonetheless, there were certainly problems within the Palestine Solidarity Movement in organizing the broadest mass protests possible. But since Trump's massive repression in the US and the Trump-brokered ceasefire in October, which has really been, as we all know, a one-sided ceasefire and not seen a real reprieve for the people of Gaza, the Palestine Solidarity Movement has been in something of a lull or a setback since then. In some ways, the movement has now retreated to a more electoral strategy, as seen in the Mamdani campaign in New York City. So Zohran Mamdani's surprising victory as mayor of New York, which is where I'm based, first in the June 2025 primary election, and then in November when he won the mayoral election. This was a political upset against establishment Democrats in the largest city in the US. Mamdani, he's a 33-year-old South Asian Muslim, and he defeated Andrew Cuomo, who's the former New York governor, who had been found guilty of sexually harassing numerous women and of hiding COVID-related nursing home deaths from the public during the height of the pandemic. Cuomo was expected to be the frontrunner in the mayoral election. And another candidate was Eric Adams, who was New York City's mayor until this January, who also polled extremely poorly in the primary and dropped out of the race soon after. Eric Adams had been extremely unpopular as mayor for being pro-cop, anti-Black Lives Matter, pro-Israel, and acquiescent to Trump, which is basically the epitome of an establishment Democrat. So while Cuomo and Adams had establishment support, they had wealthy backers and connections, Mamdani's campaign relied on hundreds of thousands of grassroots volunteers. Mamdani's victory also represented the extent to which the Palestine Solidarity Movement has affected popular consciousness, as outrage at the genocide and establishment Democrats' unwavering support for Israel was one of the major reasons that he won. For a young candidate without establishment support, who was himself part of the Palestine Solidarity Movement and participated in pro-Palestine demonstrations and called for the arrest of Netanyahu, and also calls himself a democratic socialist, for him to win over 1 million votes in New York City is no small feat. In addition, there were tens of millions of dollars put into propaganda and smears against Mamdani, including racist, Islamophobic smears, and it does mean something that, I mean, you could compare it in a way to the Jeremy Corbyn campaign, where smears of anti-Semitism really affected his campaign, but in the case of Mamdani, it did not seem to, it clearly didn't prevent his win. So that means something about the strength of the Palestine Solidarity Movement and its effect on consciousness in the US. And as I mentioned before, Mamdani's campaign galvanized hundreds of thousands of activists to organize together, often under the banner of democratic socialism and support for Palestine, and in ways that could potentially channel into other forms of organizing after the campaign. But as revolutionary socialists, we see a clear downside to this, to the movement taking this more electoral direction as well. These hundreds of thousands of campaign activists channeled their energies largely into, of course, an electoral campaign. And what's come out of the electoral campaign has been a new organization called Our Time, but so far it has been pushing people into more canvassing for Mamdani's affordability agenda. But people cannot be simply pushed from one canvas campaign to another. Plus, the new organization lacks accountability that would even be present in the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, Mamdani's organization, which he's now somewhat distancing himself from. There has also been new excitement into electing more progressive Democrats, and a renewed idea that electing enough progressives into the Democratic Party will change the party fundamentally and make it one that represents everyday people and their aspirations. This is a mistaken and dead-end approach, and one that the left has suffered from in the US for a very long time. More than anything, the Democratic Party changes candidates who take office, not the other way around. Fundamentally, the Democratic Party can never be pro-working class or pro-Palestine, as it is a party wedded to capitalism and imperialism, which is why, for example, Democrats gave such a feeble response to Trump's bombing of Venezuela. They hardly opposed it at all. To look at the Mamdani phenomenon charitably, however, I think that at this moment in time, people are thinking multiple things at once. Even those people who are looking to electoral solutions are also learning from the fight against ICE that there needs to be self-organization and that people need to protect themselves and not rely on the police, the state, the governor, or the mayor. So there are contradictions. There are also contradictions already in Mamdani's politics, and more will emerge as time goes on. This includes his stance on Palestine. He's folded to pressure to distance himself from the phrase, globalize the Intifada, for example. In his first day in office, Mamdani revoked the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is a very important act. But he also castigated pro-Palestine protesters, and unnecessarily, in my opinion, called Hamas a terrorist organization. He has also kept the New York Police Department Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch in her position, even though she is known for her racialized policing, expanding surveillance, including against Muslims, supporting Israel, and even having trained in Israel. We also cannot forget that there remains a right wing in New York that will aim to thwart whatever progressive measures Mamdani puts in place. He largely ran on a platform of affordability, policies like free childcare and free buses and a rent freeze, measures that probably sound commonplace or like not much of a big deal in Europe, but are somehow totally left-wing ideas in the US. So even with these seemingly basic measures, landlords and capitalists will likely step in to put a stop to them. Mass movements that are independent of a political party are desperately needed, and ones that can push back on Mamdani when more of his contradictions emerge. Unfortunately, there is a section of the left that is conservatively defensive of whatever Mamdani or other so-called progressive Democrats do, and this section of the left acts as if these individuals are our only hope rather than actually organizing from below and independently of them. Finally, we cannot forget that there is polarization and right-wing, in the case of New York, there's right-wing New Yorkers on a popular level too, but also across the country. In the case of Mamdani won just over 50% of the vote in November, with 41% of the vote for the racist sexual harasser, Cuomo. That's just another reminder that while millions of people have been politicized over the past years and have been moved by struggles like Black Lives Matter, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and the fight against ICE, there are still others who are fine voting for rapists and are taking up other reactionary ideas on a whole swath of issues. The polarization that began to accelerate after 2008 has continued with both a new and growing left and a terrifying far right. Can I take 1 minute? I realize this is not I have my final version. This isn't quite the final version, so 1 second, sorry. And I keep reminding myself to go slower, but okay. Okay. So speaking of the far right in the US has absolutely reared its head over the past 10 years. And it's been aided both by Trump and by the backlash to Black Lives Matter and the backlash to advances in feminism and the Me Too movement, for example. Democrats like Biden aided in the backlash, especially the backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement. He spent years demonizing, Biden and other Democrats spent years demonizing slogans and demands like defund the police, with Biden insisting on providing billions in additional funding to the police. In addition to the right's, defense of racism and the police, the far right has had as its central tenet an anti-trans ideology, pushing forward traditional gender roles, policing of gender non-conforming people, and hatred of women and queer people. And all of these ideas have, unfortunately, for the past 5 or so years, become more mainstream. So there's been a total regression, I would say, especially in pushing back against feminist ideas. Far-right personalities are well-funded and all over the internet. They include the likes of Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated in September. Charlie Kirk had founded a right-wing student organization closely tied to the Trump administration. And in the wake of Kirk's assassination, some 150 people were fired or disciplined for criticizing him. After Charlie Kirk was killed, there was a whole effort to portray him as if he was a symbol of democracy and debate by the right wing, when in reality he had made blatantly racist and sexist remarks, to say the least, and white nationalist remarks. Even popular liberal television host Jimmy Kimmel, for example, had his show canceled temporarily for criticizing Trump and Charlie Kirk, until millions of people canceled their subscriptions to the television network, and it was forced to reinstate his show. So that just gives you an idea of the stifling of speech and criticism of the right or of the Trump regime right now. So the right wing claims that the left has won the culture wars in the US and that universities are bastions of far left radicalism, but unfortunately the terrain is far more contested, with right wing ideas having a major platform and massive audience, particularly in young men, young white men, but also growing numbers of men of color, in that the right provides an explanation for why their conditions are poor, basically. But now I'll end with talking a little bit about what the left looks like. So the left, however, has continued to see considerable growth in the US, particularly since Bernie's run for president as a self-described democratic socialist in 2016, leading to the massive growth of the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, I'll call it from now on. DSA is still the largest socialist organization in the country, though it is limited by a fundamental contradiction in that it prioritizes electoralism and specifically electing progressive Democrats, some of whom are not very progressive actually. So it prioritizes electoralism over any other forms of protest or organizing. The DSA is a broad tent organization. It includes a variety of political perspectives, but its leadership has a conservative and top-down pull. To give an idea, I think it has about 90,000 members in the US, and that's the largest left-wing organization. Among the Democratic Socialists are a layer of those who unfortunately prioritize disciplining the rest of the left, which is chastising those who criticize electeds and tacking their arguments to the right. This is the case of the Jacobin magazine, which is tied to the DSA's conservative leadership and has, especially over the past couple of years, increasingly been making arguments that are pro-natalist, arguments that you see the right wing making about the need to have more babies in that case. Or criticizing the Palestine Solidarity Movement for being too far left, arguing for a focus on working with progressive Democrats over any other areas of struggle, and so on. But outside the DSA, there are other more far left organizations, but another quagmire or issue many of them fall into is campism, or you could say a certain type of Stalinism. So several organizations that took part in the Black Lives Matter movement and are now prominent within the Palestine Solidarity movement, with young activist and socialist members, have a knee-jerk anti-imperialism and anti-US sentiment, which is of course a good thing. But without much knowledge of the rest of the world, they flatten the realities of other countries and put their hopes in states like Russia, China, and Iran, or the axis of resistance, which Leila talked about last night, which is a dangerous misunderstanding of imperialist dynamics today and of shifting imperialist rivalries, and also of the future we want, or of democracy or bottom-up socialism. These organizations have also withheld solidarity from
One
movements.
second, please. Sorry, we have another issue with the presentation.
Okay.
Back online and
No problem. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the question was, could I? Oh, but then there's can't be translation. I have to wait. Good point. We can translate. Are you sure? Yes. Should I answer the question? Oh, it's okay. So the question was, could I explain the term campism? So the term campism, it could also be described as Stalinism, although people who use it, do you want me to speak slowly or does it matter?
Together on getting the whole picture.
Okay, so although some people, aren't cognizant of the fact that they're using Stalinist ideas, but it comes from this idea that there are two camps in the world, basically a pro-US camp and an anti-US camp, and that basically people who follow campism.
okay, we're back online. Thanks.
Okay. So it comes from the Cold War, basically. So the idea that if you're against the US, then we should side with you. So in today, it looks like being soft on Russia, China, and Iran, and seeing those or any state that says something against the US must be an ally, even though usually they're authoritarian states. Are you translating that or not? Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to be cognizant. Okay. So these organizations that I mentioned, some of them are explicitly Stalinist organizations, and some of them, I would just say, campist in the sense that they have taken on those ideas but aren't explicitly Stalinist. They have also withheld solidarity from movements that have been fighting dictatorships, as I mentioned, often apologizing for dictatorships that espouse anti-US sentiment, even as they massacre their own people, in the case of Iran today. On the other hand, there's a broader left growing in the US with layers of people politicized by Black Lives Matter, and we shouldn't forget that between 15 and 25 million Americans took part in the 2020 George Floyd uprising, which was the latest Black Lives Matter uprising. And then layers of people by the radicalized by the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and now by the fight against ICE. Most of these people are not organized socialists, but they're learning, as I've said, they need to become more organized in the resistance against Trump. These layers of people are open to left-wing and socialist ideas, and the moment today gives hope for a growth in organization and a more serious left. Within Tempest, our organization, we think that people on the broad left in the US are now more than ever open to our ideas, including anti-racism, defense of migrants, support for Palestine, and the need to organize ourselves rather than rely on politicians to get out of the multiple crises that we're in. People are making connections between what Trump is doing abroad and his repression and attacks on immigrants in the US, as the slogan of last weekend's protests, no war, no kings, no ICE shows. And Tempest has an anti-campus position that is relatively unique, unfortunately it's still relatively unique on the left. Any real resistance cannot be based on allegiance to other authoritarian regimes, which inevitably alienates migrants from those countries, and many others with more critical analyses. Trump's popularity is plummeting. He may have hoped that his attack on Venezuela would restore his popularity, but his imperialism, warmongering, and ramping up of ICE attacks is only doing the opposite. Additionally, the Epstein files have rocked his credibility among his own base. His policies have made life more unaffordable and worsened conditions for the vast majority of people in the US, which is also undermining his appeal. In response, he continues to become more authoritarian, both internationally and in the US, with a likelihood that he'll try to interfere in the upcoming midterm elections, for example. So on the left, there will be a continued contradiction between the pull of electoralism, especially as the midterm elections approach, people saying, we have to put Democrats forward, we have to put progressives forward. And then on the other hand, the urgency of responding to his escalating attacks and ICE's violent raids. Tempest is working with various social movements and the labor movement to try to build healthy and independent resistance against Trump and all the crises that spawned him. And I'll stop there.
Now we have time for an extensive Q&A session after those two very dense inputs. I think we'll be distributing also a microphone amongst the crowd. Great. And you can ask them a wide range of questions from large geopolitical analysis to their daily activist work. Always good and fair. You can also ask your question in German and it will be translated. Exactly. Right, so I guess I'll just open the floor and we'll see what arises.
it out loud.
Yeah, we can try, sure. Yeah. All right.
Hello. First of all, I want to thank both of you for coming today and kind of giving this update. To me, it's quite hopeful to know that there's very local community-based groups forming, especially around what's happening with the ICE situation. But my question is, again, being optimistic, is there any way that these local community-based groups are connecting with one another? Because it's a smaller scale that they're dealing with through the neighborhoods. Like, is there a larger network forming to where they're connected based on their collective interests? If you could maybe share about that. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Question before, Philip. Yeah, they're linking together. I mean, I know that there are different forces supporting ICE defense in different cities. In San Diego, before any of the ICE defense groups were formed, there was a meeting of 90 people in January, probably 2 weeks after the inauguration. Mostly immigrant people, many undocumented, and many just from organizations related to that. And that then became the organization that all of the community defense organizations affiliated with. So when I said that there are 5, and now maybe 7, there might end up being more by the time I get back home, of these types of organizations, that's not a reflection of division. I think also importantly, there's potential, and I'm trying to do this and encouraging Tempest and everybody else on the left and in the labor movement to do this. There's a potential to knit this new mass community self-organization into the labor movement. And if that happens, looking at the Chicago example, that's how you start to change the unions themselves, make them stronger. But when we are going to do these community or these county ICE defense trainings for county workers, we're going to have members of the community defense organizations at those buildings. Some county workers might join their neighborhood defense committee. If more working people have experience of the blossoming community organization, that's going to transform what they do in their unions, their sense of initiative, their sense of militancy, their sense of solidarity. So I think that's like a higher sort of unity that has to be sought.
Oh, I can add to it. Oh, okay. I think there are contradictions and it's messy. At least in New York City, there's, during Mamdani's campaign, there were some major liberal groups that came together, and I think this was a positive step. As I was saying, people are not just thinking electing somebody who's a socialist is enough. So these major liberal groups came together and said, well, we need to prepare for when Trump sends the National Guard to New York as a punishment for electing Mamdani. That's what they were predicting. Or sends ICE to the state. I think they imagined it coming to the state in a particular way. So they started, and we had Tempest members in New York going to these meetings. But the way ICE has come to New York has been more on the neighborhood level, right? Not on this. So the neighborhood groups have been actually more effective in that sense. But then there are problems with the neighborhood groups in that sometimes they're not, thinking they're not strategic, or they're sort of focused on, they're not as politicized in other ways, they're focused on community defense. So I think there's contradictions and complications in both. Does that resonate with you?
Different experience.
Different cities, but yeah.
Anyone else have a question? Raise your hand, I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you for previously putting the importance on education so much. I think that's what you just said at the end, Shireen, shows that education is so important also for the community-based and neighborhood-based groups and organizations so that they can be strategic. But I wanted to put the focus on something else. What comes after Trump? I think you have to strategize after Trump. It's like after Putin, what comes next? Are there forces which we cannot really see from Europe that will just step in what Trump has started? Or will your organizations and your movements and the working class be already so strong to put up against something like that? Or yeah, what's going to be the future? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And so since 2008, there was a whole wave of new left-wing forces around the world. And they've largely failed. Not all of them, or not yet, I shouldn't sound as pessimistic as that. But I believe a fundamental weakness has been shared. And it's related to the immaturity of class consciousness and class organization, which was devastated from the 70s onward. And it meant that what 2008 crystallized for people was their opposition to inequality. That's a great place to start. What is only being clarified with time is the sense that our class has power. And for some of us, at least, our class could, can, and should rule. But that's not obvious from a social reality in which labor is not part of people's, labor movement is not part of people's daily and regular experience. What I'm saying is that alternatives to the system that has led to Trumpism, I think there's in the US we think of it just as a two-party system which is jointly responsible for Trumpism. The Democrats are not nearly as bad as Trumpism, but they enable it. It would have been impossible without the role that they've played, especially in the neoliberal era. So I think we can expect, left-wing alternatives, that's what we need, to be hobbled until that grassroots organizational and consciousness deficit is overcome. And it's being overcome. So I think when authoritarianism, when autocracy is defeated, determines what the possibilities will be for change. And so I think the level of neighborhood organization and labor organization right now, I expect that to begin sprouting political consequences, political organization that are more independent and more based in its masses on a sense of our class having not just opposition to equality, not just being victims and we need someone elected to save us, but a sense that we create an accountable whole and that we have power to act independently, to keep any elected leadership accountable and so forth. That's what the process of grassroots and working class self-organization and struggle is solidifying. And that'll solidify the strength of alternatives to overcome, the huge weaknesses that we've seen in the new. I'm very hopeful about the fact that this new left experience happened around the world. It shouldn't be a subject of pessimism. This would have been unthinkable that a new left would have arisen 30 years ago. People thought it's the end of history. There is no more working class and there is no more left, and forget about social. That's what people thought. But that has begun to change. It's gone through a first iteration, which has had painful failures, which teach lessons. But more than lessons, we need the experience of self-organization to create, strong alternatives.
We're gonna change tactics. We're gonna gather some questions first, and then we'll respond. So you just raise your hand and go right down.
I would like to thank you for your activism. Is me speaking here? Yes, I would like to thank you for your activism, and I wonder if your personal lives are at risk for being activists in the States. Like, do you face any kind of attacks, or I don't know? What does the exposure to this activism do with your lives?
I wanted to ask maybe a bit of a semantic question, but I think it's interesting because the workshop is nominally about fascism in the US, and I've got the impression that you were both kind of avoiding explicitly using the term fascism to describe the administration. And I was just wondering what your perspective is, if both of you think that the US administration is fascist, if you would call it fascist, and if you even think it matters whether or not we call it fascist, whether that's how we characterize it.
You talked about grassroots movements, and I wonder, how do you reach people who haven't been politicized by left-wing ideas yet? Is it via social media or by conversation in person, or in your experience, what are the most effective tactics to mobilize new people?
We can take one or two more. Please run the answers.
Are there Palestine protests now, or only anti-ICE protests? Is there one more?
We are in Switzerland and you are in the USA, and you have no request on you for us. What have you to do? We also, here we fight also. How do you request to make fight together? Explain.
Is it all right for the both of you if we do a first round of answers? Yeah. Do you want to ask a question too?
I asked my question in German. Gibt's in den USA jetzt noch die Klimabewegung, und ist die Klimabewegung, sind die verbunden mit Palästina?
Okay. All right, we're happy to hear your answers.
Okay, I'll take some of these. I describe the concrete aspiration of the Trump administration as autocracy, which I define as sitting between capitalist democracy and dictatorship. We see autocracy in Turkey. We see it in Hungary. In Russia, I guess maybe we're like all the way to dictatorship. In autocracy, things are just in the middle. There's still going to be elections. I don't anticipate that elections in the United States will be not held
in the next 5 years. And that's why I don't describe this objective as the achievement of fascism. There are no limits to the extremity of Trump's views. Trump is completely fine with being to the right of Hitler. That's not a joke. That's the reality we're living in. He doesn't have to do that. It's not his objective per se. So individuals you could describe as fascists in terms of their leanings or their views. It's often hard to define an individual as a fascist because a fascist is usually not an intellectual and usually does not create consistency in their outlook. They can. I guess there are such people. I don't think it matters too much, though. But I think it's valuable to be as precise as we can in our thinking about what we're facing. There's a climate movement in the United States, and it's peaked in terms of trying to organize protests and organize like sit-ins at politicians' offices to pressure them was around 2018, 2019. That's when it peaked. It hasn't gone away. I don't think it's as strong as it was. We have a climate denialist president and a lot of skepticism about climate. There are attempts to, including in my union, I'm in San Diego, but there's a much larger SEIU, that's my union, in San Francisco Bay Area. They created a climate committee in that union. And that union tried to merge worker demands with climate justice demands. For example, they organized workers at airports. And those workers were facing health problems from their exposure to jet fuel. Also, they had in their political area the potential to demand that oil pumps, because they have oil in the Bay Area, have to be a greater distance from residential areas. And so they successfully created a movement that was simultaneously for worker justice and climate justice. I don't know a lot about it other than that example. I think there are other places, though, where the climate justice movement is attempting to merge with labor and talk about, a green transition, green economic transition that would be pro-worker. From Switzerland, there's a very short-term and very important thing that you can do, which is protest Trump Monday. I think Monday's the day, right? Please build that as much as possible. What is devastating for me, oftentimes, is the international compliance with Trumpism, the strategy employed to say, oh, let's have him get gifts when he visits our country, because then he'll be nice and he won't do whatever threat. This feeds the dictatorship dynamic. And punish your politicians, punish any leaders who kissed butt to Trump. If Swiss politicians, if European politicians, and they are, if the heads of NATO, Trump doesn't care about at all. I don't either, but that's from a different side, for opposite reasons. When they kiss butt, make them pay a price. Make there be outrage. Blame them and accuse them for what they're doing, which is appeasement. They are appeasing autocracy. And so, if you make it harder for your politicians or leaders of any sort to engage in that, we feel a lot better. And you're helping the struggle. Should I pass it over to you? I know I didn't answer them all, so let's make sure we get them all.
not sure. We can go back and forth until we remember them all. In terms of personal lives at risk, I mean, you're reminding me that there is a case of a professor, Tom Alter, who is a professor in Texas, who was on, he was on a webinar conference, which I was also, we were both speakers on this webinar conference. I was speaking about Palestine, and he said something, well, the fact that he's a professor in Texas made him, he was fired from his position basically for speaking, just saying that we need a revolution or something like that. So, but that is the case of particularly Trump's attacks on higher education, and in certain states like Texas, you have fewer protections, unions illegal. So in states like Texas and Florida with their right-wing governors, in addition, added to the attacks on higher education by Trump, makes you basically in real jeopardy. Basically, professors, other folks in academia are susceptible when they speak their ideas openly. But there is a campaign now for Tom Alter, which I think you can follow online. So he is, speaking in different places around the country. There's an attempt to fight back. But even a few days ago, right after the Trump's attacks on Venezuela, there was a video that you probably saw of a woman just giving an interview in the street about why she's opposed to Trump's attacks on Venezuela, and she was taken away she was arrested and taken into a car. So there's definitely a level of fear and lack of democratic or the ability for free speech, I guess. But at the same time, I think we don't want to be preemptively, people have asked, if you're writing, do you want to use a pen name? And I'll say, no, we don't want to preemptively silence ourselves. But of course, we are all taking precautions, like as individuals and as Tempest as a whole. I mean, just things that we have to do on the left anyway, in terms of taking precautions and security. But not diving too far into security culture. In terms of closer to fascism, in his first presidency, I would have argued more what you were saying. I would have argued against the label of I would have debated harder, but in this second presidency, Trump's levels of attacks, I am okay with people calling it fascism, or at least saying it's on the en route to fascism. I mean, when Elon Musk gives a Nazi salute was that at the inauguration? And then the response to Charlie, like there are different instances where you see, as I mentioned, the response to Charlie Kirk's assassination was a firing of people who were said any criticism of Charlie Kirk, who had been an open white nationalist, right? And he was very close to the Trump administration. Or when Trump was demonizing Somalis before sending more ICE agents to Minneapolis, Minnesota, he was using specifically white nationalist rhetoric against them. So those are just a couple examples of why I wouldn't argue against someone who's calling it fascism this time around. In terms of how to reach people, I think as a socialist group, we want to reach people who are already being politicized. We don't want to reach someone, our main goal is not the person who's been unaffected by all the struggles of the past 5 or 10 years. Our main audience is people who are maybe not yet socialists, but are moved by Black Lives Matter, Palestine. Those are our first people who are coming out to protest, who might have different ideas about what's the way forward. But yeah, I would say that's the priority. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there is is a problem that the right wing, and I was told by people that it's similar here too, that the right wing has such a strong presence in social media, podcasts. So even with Tempest, we started in 2020, by the way, so we're still relatively new, but we're starting to put ourselves out there on social media and different platforms because we recognize it is a problem and we can't cede all of that to the right. Yeah, unfortunately, if I think about it, I can think of like one really strong left-wing podcaster and dozens of far-right ones. Anyway, in terms of, oh, I also had written down about, fascism in the past, requiring a workers' movement that was defeated and crushed, and today it doesn't seem to be requiring that. Anyway, that was the previous point. The last thing was, are Palestine protests still continuing? Yes, they are. Great question. Thanks for asking that. I would say that the fight against ICE has taken over it as the primary fight right now. And I think there's a level of confusion in the Palestine solidarity movement since not October 7th, October, the start of the ceasefire process. Because initially that was thought of as a victory for the movement, and then there's kind of like, which way do we go forward? But there are still protests, but right now it's more about specific demands or campaigns, like specific BDS campaigns. So the boycott movement, break the bonds campaign within the BDS movement. Or like in New York, we have protests against land sales, which have, I don't know if I should go into that, but Mamdani there's been a whole controversy about that, and Mamdani has criticized the protesters, but there have been protests against, basically they do Zionist land sales where people meet, they bring them to synagogues, and they're like, here's some very affordable land you can buy in Israel. So anyway, there have been protests about that, and unfortunately Mamdani has not been on our side about that. But yeah, there's still, coming out of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I would say the group that has transformed the most is Jewish Voice for Peace, which is still having actually sort of a similar dynamic, and Tempest is involved with them. They have a very top-down national organization, but there's been an attempt again in New York to make neighborhood groups and have more democratic spaces where people can discuss and debate the way forward. So that's part of what the Palestine movement looks like now.
I just wanted to put my own take on the question of how we reach people today. And I, tech troglodyte, I can't tell you a single thing about valuable ways to reach people through social media. And I know how important that is today. I know how we've got to do it. I'm not, far be it for me to say we don't need to do that. I mean, as far as getting people to join a revolutionary or socialist organization, etc., I agree with Shireen that that's not everybody who's open to that. I think we have to create organizations and spaces that can bring in a lot more than just those people. And then create a relationship between that wider group of people and the people who are saying more what the people in this room are saying. And that's going to be important for like revolutionary socialists, etc., working together in not becoming insular and not becoming a group that learns to talk to each other at the expense of ever being able to talk to anybody else. You can only do that if you have the contact. That's what maintains the discipline to do that. And we have to rebuild class consciousness at a mass level. We had this a century ago. It's never gone away entirely. But in every country, almost, there was a sense among the mass of working class people that capitalism was not their system and that they were exploited by it and that they and we had power. That didn't make them socialists or revolutionaries or anything. But they believed opposite things at the same time. But they had some of that. And I think today there has to be an aim at the long-term goal of recreating a mass, class-conscious, socialist-leaning working class. It won't even be necessarily all of it, but it has to be mass. It has to be millions of people. Then within that, revolutionaries have to play a part creating it so that we can be in contact with it and influence it and then grow the more specific hardcore within the middle. But I'm talking about a process of years and decades. And to me, I see fruit in this process from one-on-one conversations. It's helpful if you're in a union, it's helpful if you can do it in a workplace context, but today, at least in the US, with the outrages and mass horror about what people understand is the beginning of the end of democracy, almost everyone can be connected into some kind of work and organizing based on their individual situation. So I want us to not lose focus on the individual work with people wherever they're at and connecting them to stuff that they could do that makes sense, that might be just very little at first. Yeah.
Okay, we've been going at it for a while now, but we have still some time for finishing questions. So, anyone of you still has a thought in their mind?
Unions left or right some?
That's a great question. In the back? In the back.
I'm interested in what kind of escalation you probably are thinking about that could happen, especially with being one of the most armed nations, and the Second Amendment, which was, I think, one of the reasons it was implemented is to go against government tyranny. So I don't want to fetishize any civil war or anything, but could you tell me how the dynamic is if people are experiencing so much violence? When is the point that arms are being an option, or do you see that happening?
When you talked about the one-on-one conversations, I thought a lot about like the concept of organizable power that like is very popular right now in Switzerland. Like I work for the Union of Public Services, and there it is like the main thing to do right now, and also for the feminist strike 2027, the collective thinks about like organizing people that way. Do you think that's a good system, or yeah?
All right, I think that's a strong set of questions to end. Maybe there's one more. I think we'll leave it at that.
I talked about this with Avery already in the break, but if we talk about Switzerland and Switzerland's responsibility also for what happens in the United States, we just have to mention there are landowners. There is the group of the nations of indigenous peoples, and if we think we can do something, then we can actually resist against nuclear power here, because that actually destroys the lives of indigenous peoples. Or if we think that we have no resources whatsoever in Switzerland, and the resources come from the United States, Canada, and South American countries, and that again destroys environment, that brings us back to the climate movement and the lives of indigenous peoples. We just have to see that we can do there also something here in Switzerland that brings back also and that we can work together. And I wish that the workers' movement in the United States would more also see this connection. Thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Thanks. So So you talked about the necessity of class consciousness. So my question would be, does the election of Zohran Mamdani helps or harms this?
Can I just start with the first one? Okay. In terms of escalations, I would say the escalations we need on our side, I would say no, I don't think there's a likelihood of civil war in the US. but the escalation that we need on our side is mass protest on the one hand. Like, think about the George Floyd rebellion where millions of people were on the street and that was a massive sea change in consciousness. I mean, that movement changed the world, that affected anti-racist sensibilities around the world. But it wasn't enough just to have mass protest. Of course, there needs to be and what we have now is a step forward in terms of people realizing we need to get organized, and mass protest without that continuous organization is not enough. But also, I think the thing that's made me hopeful over the past couple of weeks is, in Minnesota, they're calling for the shutdown on January 23rd. The unions are calling for it, and unions, as Avery talked about, the unions in the US are relatively weak, so we'll see. The fact that they're calling for this is huge, I think. We'll see what they're able to pull off. But the fact that students have in several states where ICE has been, not just Minnesota, students have essentially been striking in some states, like refusing to go to school en masse because of ICE attacks affecting so many students of color, and ICE going to their high schools and attacking them after school, or basically attacking students of color after school. But there is a problem in the US where some people are looking to individual solutions. There are times where, because of low class consciousness or a feeling like, how do we get out of these crises, people are looking to individual solutions. So there have been, that's why you've seen the assassination of Charlie Kirk, assassination attempts against Donald Trump. But kind of ironically, largely those are from the right or the far right. I guess the Luigi Mangione would be an exception, but that's not somebody who has class consciousness. That's not the way forward. So I would say what I'm looking to as the way forward is to see what's happening in Minnesota, if January 23rd will be a success, and also, have we talked about Made It Strong? Okay. An attempt to build towards a general strike in the next couple of years. That's the first question. I'll come back later.
I think Mamdani shares a lot of the dynamics of Sanders. And Sanders developed class consciousness. We've never seen that from a candidate inside the Democratic Party, really. He framed issues because he's a socialist in terms of class. He has a limited understanding of what class struggle means. We shouldn't limit the idea of class struggle to economic struggle. The fight for the defense of immigrants, that is a class struggle. The fight against police brutality, which terrorizes not just the black population, but the black population more than any other, is part of keeping a whole section of our class down. When the capitalists keep a section of our class down, they don't do it so they can pay them less and then give the other workers the leftovers. They do it so they can have more profit. And not only that, but when you drive down, say, the black or the immigrant working class, and they're paid less because they're more terrified and they can't organize and fight, then that creates downward labor market pressure for all working class people. That actually drags down the wages and living standards of everyone.
So every issue of oppression is and has to be seen as a class issue. And that's what full class consciousness means. And Sanders and Mamdani, Sanders more than Mamdani, but both of them still subscribe to this limited and partial vision of class consciousness. The other thing is that while Sanders created a historic rise, even though it was a limited version of class consciousness, but a historic and invaluable rise in class consciousness and class thinking, he was pursuing a political strategy that has ended in failure. And when you do that, when you organize people into a movement and raise their hopes and it's tied up with their class consciousness, and you drive it off a cliff toward failure, that's a problem. So the rise of class consciousness and the framing in class terms that Mamdani is currently creating is something that we have to rescue. It's our job to rescue this rise of class consciousness from the peril that it is in. And I'm really happy to hear about what Helena brought up about ideas for solidarizing with the indigenous people's struggle, which is also a key element of a class-conscious understanding, is solidarity with the indigenous struggle in the United States. The examples you raised about how to support from Switzerland sound good. I didn't have previous thoughts or ideas about that. I just want to highlight in relation to this that the rise, because there has been a rise, in indigenous people's struggle and support for their rights in the last several years has also been an element that has strengthened the solidarity with the immigrant population. Indigenous peoples, especially in the southwest of the United States, often call out and see themselves as a cross-border people who the border has arbitrarily drawn between their very lives and their very communities. And so they have been quick to stand in solidarity with immigrants and oppose the imposition of border patrol and border enforcement activity right on their lands. That's a direct conflict with the sovereignty of their national territories when the federal government is attempting to do immigration enforcement that they oppose in their areas. Okay. I agree about, I think there is going to be more violence. I think when you have an atomized society that's deorganized and its consciousness has been drained, you have more isolated and deranged individuals. And we must not abandon sympathy with people, but not have any illusions or give any support to the idea that, like, the attempt to assassinate Trump is going to help us. Right. Or the attempt to do any kind of stuff like that. The fact is that terrorist violence, individual violence, these things can serve to change the world in a bad way. They can work for the right. They can work for authoritarianism. They can work for fascism. They can't work for us. They are always used against us. And this increasingly tense society, well, I think just on the left, we have to promote the understanding that it's only collective action and workers' power above all that is going to be the tool that saves us. And these other attempts, which there are going to be more of, is something that we have to inoculate people against that kind of a thinking to try to minimize that stuff happening. And unions are mostly liberal in the United States. And a few are conservative. Some of them are like Border Patrol unions, have endorsed Trump. There are police unions. We try to, and most of the labor movement really wants nothing to do, fortunately, with police and Border Patrol unions. The head of the truck drivers union flirts with Trump all the time. There's opposition within the truck drivers union. So unions are not, they are more to the left compared to society as a whole.
They have 13 million members, and they have a vast political range, and they have a leadership which is politically mostly liberal, but hesitant on action and militancy. And then there's revolutionaries within it, there's potential to transform it. That's an ongoing struggle. You know, I know you had a question, I was very intrigued by it, but I think we both wanted more clarification on it. Maybe after, we're about done. Okay, well, I'll let Shireen talk and then, yeah.
I don't want to take too much time, so I'll just end on a couple thoughts about Mamdani. Yeah, talk to us after. Mamdani's win is a reflection of, I think I said this in my talk, but I'll say it again. Mamdani's win was a reflection of the consciousness of the Palestine Solidarity Movement and that change in consciousness. And you know, we're still waiting to see. He's had some contradictions, like I mentioned, during his campaign. He was actually receiving so much racist attack and criticism, and a lot of it was about the phrase globalize the Intifada. And he did bow to pressure on that and said, I won't say that, I'll distance myself from saying that, which is unfortunate. But in his acceptance speech, the night he won, he was quoting Eugene Debs and speaking openly as, a democratic socialist, not a revolutionary socialist, but he was saying quite radical things about what is needed for the way forward. So the question is really what comes from his win, and basically what is needed is movements that will hold him accountable and movements that will continue to build grassroots pressure and unfortunately, as I mentioned during my talk, something that came out of it in New York is the Our Time movement, which seems very liberal, is top-down. Mamdani came out of the Democratic Socialist of America, but this Our Time movement isn't even accountable in the way that the DSA is. And the DSA also has deep problems of lack of democracy and being top-down. I was a member for a couple of years, I could go on about that, but I won't. And then the other problem is, as I mentioned earlier, there are sections of the left, including the leadership of DSA, which is so concerned with policing the rest of the left and saying, you can't critique our progressive electives, like they're our only hope. And that's clearly an obstacle. And that's the opposite of what we need. But I'll just say one last thing, because I've been a longtime Palestine solidarity activist. The Palestine solidarity movement in the US has gone in waves. So in Trump's first presidency, there were so many attacks on Students for Justice in Palestine, which was like the main aspect of the movement at the time, that the student movement almost went underground for a little bit, and it started to turn to elected congresspeople. There were 4 women congresspeople who basically the movement was like, oh, they're our way forward. One of them was AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that turned out to be a huge failure because she became so watered down on Palestine and basically turned her back on the movement. And I think people know now you can't just rely on one or a group of politicians. So there is that higher level of consciousness. Even though there's excitement about Mamdani, even though some people are like, well, we need more progressive electives, there's also an understanding that that's not enough. So that's, yeah. And obviously, since October 7th, the need for grassroots mass mobilization has become common sense again. I know there's a setback. There's been a setback in the movement, but I don't think that has gone away at all. So, yeah. I'll end there. I know we're over time. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's, thank you to our terrific interpreters. Without them, it would be also a big thanks to you for joining us here and showing great endurance in this dense session. I would also please can add that this event, for it to happen, does need donations from your side. So if you can give something, we would be very happy and thankful. On the way out, you can give us cash, you can also scan and tweet us some money. Thank you very much in advance. Then on the way out, you can also add your thoughts to the thought wall, what this event invoked in you, or whatever goes through your mind. We're very curious. Please join us in the afternoon sessions, also here in the Volkshaus. Then there's also a closing panel, and there's a solidarity party at Profitreff, cash only. Please join us there. We're looking forward to seeing you, and have a great break.